The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
The subject of death and dying can be a very difficult conversation to have. Many of us avoid having the conversation because it makes us uncomfortable. We don't want to worry or upset our loved ones, and we really don't want to face tough questions or think about our own death. Having open conversations about death and dying allows us to prepare ourselves and our loved ones on how we would like to create our own end-of-life journey. On every episode of Guided Crossings, we will explore a different part of the dying process and offer suggestions on how to prepare your loved ones as well as yourself. I'm your host, Andrea Sebastian, and this is Guided Crossings. Hello and welcome to Guided Crossings. I'm your host, Andrea Sebastian. Filling out a lot of the paperwork when you pass or before you pass can seem like a very overwhelming task. But today, my guest is Janice McDermott, who's going to tell us all about what needs to be filled out and how to do it. Janice, welcome to Guided Crossings. I know,
Andrea.
Just a little pressure.
Yeah, no
I know.
pressure.
I just give us a little bit of an overview, I guess. So you have 35 years of hospice experience. Mm-hmm. And how did you get involved in hospice?
Well, first, Andrea, thank you for having me today.
You're
This
welcome.
is a great opportunity to talk about things. So I'll answer that question first, and then we'll talk about forms. Yeah, 35 years. It's the best work I've ever done. And I started because I was working for the visiting nurses in Nashua, so right here. And hospice was not even spoken about when I started there. It was the early 80s, but I had a very close friend that I grew up with who died when I was 25, and I started working at the VNA soon after, and the nurses heard my story. I was doing social work. The nurses heard my story and said, you know, we're going to start sending you to these meetings in Nashua because they're talking about having a hospice program for people at end of life. And of course the goal was for people not to be alone when they were dying and for people to be able to stay at home when they were dying. Things that were not spoken about at that point in time. So they started sending me to meetings, and after a couple of years they did create the hospice, community hospice of Greater Nashua, and I was the second employee.
Oh, nice.
that was hired. So right from the ground floor, I started helping to build hospice programs in the state. So I did a lot of different things, which a big part of my job was to recruit and train hospice volunteers and to train the staff in the visiting nurses and in the hospice program as it grew about end-of-life care. And, you know, I brought in lots of speakers, but it's as you know, it's a fairly lengthy training.
It is a lengthy training, and it's not for everyone. And I, really commend you on 35 years and, recently going through the hospice, not knowing what it was beforehand and stuff like that. I mean, good job. I know it was a team, but you did a really good job. There's some really, it's a very impressive program. And I know from experience too, it helps so many people. So, it's been 35 years and I'm sure it went up by really, really quick, but good job,
Thank you.
So let's just, hypothetically, I'm ready to do my end of life plan and I don't know where to start. How do we start this?
Yeah. So I have to start by saying, in the old days, in my parents' generation, people literally went to the lawyer's office, they got the forms, and they filled them out, and they gave them back, and they got locked up for all eternity.
Yep.
And people who were designated in those forms to make decisions for health care or for finance didn't know it a lot of the time until they were called on to perform those tasks. And things have evolved quite a bit, but the advanced care planning documents are in legal statute, and there is a document that looks like this, Advanced Care Planning Guide, that you can get from the Foundation for Healthy Communities in New Hampshire. So you can just find it online and order one of these, or you can download the forms on your computer. So they include things that everyone knows about that are durable power of attorney for health care and living wills. So what this is talking about is just health care. If you went to the lawyer's office and said, I want to create a will, it would include this, but it would also include information about your finance and wishes around your belongings. So I'm not a lawyer. I am not going to lead you through the actual filling out of the forms. What I will tell you is that each state has their own legal documents, and they're not all the same.
Of course not.
Of course not. And guess what? New Hampshire's have been more complicated than most.
Okay.
So we have made some inroads, even recently, to try and simplify them so that people who might have residency in New Hampshire but also spend part of the year in Florida, for example, or also go to the doctors in Massachusetts, have some crossover so that the documents will be honored wherever they are.
So it's interesting, when we were talking a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned, like, you know, when you do go get a lawyer, there's certain types of lawyers you were saying that would be better to address this than all.
Yeah.
Can you touch on that a little bit?
Sure. So estate lawyers can do this. Absolutely. There are also healthcare lawyers. So lawyers who specialize in healthcare decisions, who usually are a little more in the weeds with this stuff, and work with hospitals, for example, work with healthcare facilities and know more of the ins and outs of these documents. So I think they are probably the best equipped. But you also can do these documents for healthcare without a lawyer. You still need witnesses, a notary, and it's best to do them in the healthcare facilities who serve you. So the hospital usually has a social worker, the home care hospice agency has a social worker. So to go to them, they might bring it up with you, but to go to them and ask for guidance on this can be a really good idea because they're so familiar with all of the language.
Right. So when you do your end of life plan, and just let's talk for a second on the health care aspect of it, should you then give obviously a copy of it all to your physician, or like how does that all work?
Great question. Again, the fact that prior generations sort of locked them up and didn't even tell the kids where they were.
Right. Yes.
A lot
Big
of
hunt.
It was.
It's got to be in here somewhere.
Well, it was more of it. The first question was, do you have one?
Right.
So now the guidance absolutely is to fill it out and bring a copy with you. So there's been discussion about, should we have our documents scanned and on a thumb drive that maybe could be a bracelet, or there's different ways to make it more accessible. We don't have a registry in this state. There's been talk about that. So some states do. So in other words, if you had an emergency, EMTs could pull up your documents from a central file. That doesn't exist here yet, but that's a possibility. So if you're talking about forms, yes, you can scan them and make sure that you have them with you. But your doctor's office should have a copy. Now, people have specialists, right? We often don't have just one doctor anymore. So they need to be with whoever provides care for you, and if you have home care, hospice care, nursing home care, there needs to be a copy in your health care file wherever it exists. But I think it's most important that your decision maker, whoever that is, has a copy.
Well, I was just going to say, we were talking in a previous show about having the conversation, and something as simple as who your doctor is.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I look at my dad, he'll be 90 in July, and I don't know his doctor.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, I know where his documents and stuff are,
Right.
but, having that conversation going, oh, okay, this is where you go, or this is what you do, can be pretty beneficial, I think.
Right. Yeah, I mean, my husband died suddenly several years ago now, and I had to totally rethink this. And I've now been saying to my kids, okay, this is where I'm putting my important papers. This is where I'm putting your important papers, because neither of them have partners, and, they'd be looking to me for some of those things. So I think it's very important, and as I've set things up for my own care, I said the same thing, like, how will they know who to contact? So to have a book, to have everything in one place, and people tell me they have a box, they have some kind of notebook. One of my favorite stories is a good friend of mine who, when his father was dying, he was told he would be the son, my friend, was told he would be the durable power of attorney, and his father had created a book called Rigged for Croak.
Oh.
Rigged for Croak. He was someone who had a military background and liked to sail. They lived on the water, and I just loved the whole idea of that. So my friend knew exactly where to go and find everything, and it was outlined what he wanted.
Okay, can you describe, because it's really tough because we go about our day every day, we don't think about it, and then all of a sudden we could be stuck in that situation through, no fault of our own, just life happens, and it's like, do you want, hospice care? So, but if your wish was to die at home, I know you need to write it down, but what are some of the availability, like there's palliative care, which is different than hospice care. What are they?
Great question. Most people don't understand the difference between palliative care and hospice because you don't really know until you need it.
Right.
And they're both philosophy of care. They're both a team approach to care. They're both focused on goals of care for the person who's living with illness. So they're both patient-centered models of care. The biggest difference is palliative care is available to people who are still having active treatment, still looking for curative care. And hospice is when curable care is no longer an option and they choose comfort care. And none of it's a have to, there's no right or wrong.
Right, and I think that's something that everyone needs to really understand. What works for me won't work for you, vice versa. You could change your mind. I mean, these are all points that, just get it, I guess, done to some extent, you know. So hospice care as well, this was something that I thought was interesting. I always thought hospice care was in a building. So it's not always. So can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah. And I did, in my work life, we did build the community hospice house in Merrimack, which is a wonderful, wonderful gift to this community and has been well utilized.
Yeah.
There are 3 hospice houses in New Hampshire. Some states have had more. So again, in the old days, people did assume it was a place, hospice, because it started out in England and it was a place.
Right.
And then it came here, and I told you my friend died when I was 25. She died at Yale New Haven Hospital, but we never heard the word hospice. But in fact, a year later, that's where the first hospice opened in the United States.
Wow.
And it was a place. It was a building with I forget how many beds, 14 beds or something, maybe more than that. Anyway, that is because of the history of hospice. But the goal was to bring death back to a family setting because just like childbirth, it was something that had gotten too medicalized and kind of pushed aside from normal life. And everyone dies, everyone's born, everyone dies, and those were family events. So it was trying to bring the whole concept back that you could be cared for at home, that it's not mysterious and it's not scary and it's not something that requires a lot of technical care, even though we see now some pretty technical interventions to keep people comfortable. Most of the time people can be at home.
Well, and I think that's another point, is that hospice comes in and helps the caregivers take care of the patient who, I don't know the statistic, I remember reading it at one point, most people do want to die at home, and if they, at all costs, but it's not always something that's, feasible, unfortunately. But, then you have the wonderful hospice house, and, people take care of everybody there, and you have a team, which I think is another part of it that people don't understand, Right, so the team comes whether you're at home or in the nursing home or in the hospice house. You still have access to the nurse, the doctor, the social worker, the chaplain, volunteers, music therapy. I mean, there's a lot of different services that can be provided, and you have a choice. You can choose all of them or you can choose one or two of them.
most people can manage, but what you said about teaching the family is critical, because not everyone has understood that, I don't think, from the beginnings of hospice, that we don't move in. People thought we moved in. And unfortunately, we don't.
Right.
So we are there to support any hour of the day, any day of the week, but we're not going to be there in person all the time.
Yeah. So getting back to like the paperwork, the end of life plan that you have. So your hospital or your medical issues or your wishes, you know, there's a lot more to it than just a do not resuscitate.
Yeah.
Can you speak to some of the ones that, you know, maybe are good to, so our viewers might not even, because I don't really know, I always think of do not resuscitate.
Yeah.
And then I guess my dad had a pacemaker put in October, and someone said make sure he writes somewhere that he has a pacemaker, because that can keep going even in the event that he passes, which that can't be pleasant.
Yeah.
So, you know, can you talk to that a little bit?
So I'm not a nurse, and I'm not the doctor.
Yeah.
But those, absolutely. So when you fill out this paperwork, you might be doing it because you've entered hospice care.
Okay.
And then you might know the answer to some of what you're expecting for end of life, and you already know what conditions you're living with. So you can make more informed choices when you fill out forms that are asking what you would want, whether you would want certain treatments or to be artificially tube fed or something. Yes, but a lot of people are making these decisions without knowing what's going to happen to them in the future. So the most important thing is to choose someone who knows you well enough to know what your goals are. What do you value? What do you define quality of life as? So thinking about who matters to you and what matters, what do you do every day that brings you joy, that's meaningful. So you really need to have someone, before you even think about filling out the papers, that you trust to make decisions that you would want, not what they would want, what you would want. And that's really critical, because the decisions are not something we can know ahead of time.
Right. Well, I mean, you're explaining it well, because I don't know if, maybe that's why people don't have the conversation, because they're not in that situation. And again, like you said, it's changing all the time, because you don't know what your diagnosis is going to be. So you don't know what you're dealing with. Therefore, you don't know what you're going to need or want. So it's a tough one for sure.
So even though the forms, you know, they're simple questions, they're not, I should not use the word simple, but they're questions that you fill out, but you can add to that, and you need to revisit it. It's not one and done, so you need to relook at it, and that's important if you know you are living with illness at some point down the road. But it's just important in general to see if you still have the same values and the same approach for these end-of-life decisions. Lost my train of thought. Ask me another question.
Well, talking about an end-of-life plan, it's not just about medical forms and a will and that kind of thing. There's a lot you can do. You know, I when you mentioned quality of your day, like what do you do in your day? What's important to you? You know, and I read somewhere, which I thought was really interesting, it was a question like, do you prefer baths or showers? And I was like, wow, like, I don't know. You know, like, well, I know the answer, but I'm saying I would not have known that is something that can come into my everyday quality of life at the end of my life.
So you're reminding me of something, but I want to go, my train of thought came back. So you can add pieces of paper is what I wanted to say about the forms, you know. So I think of it as, if this, then this decision, if that, then a different decision, and to make those have those conversations with your decision maker, but also your physician.
Right.
What happens if my pacemaker is still working when I die? You know, ask those questions, because then in the forms you can say, if this happens, I want this. I want it stopped, or I want, you know. Okay, now the current question.
The question was when you want the quality of life
Yeah.
and what you do on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So what is important to you? So like even
yes.
Okay.
So I'm back.
You're back.
So when we were first doing hospice, we realized that the philosophy of care suggested that maybe we wanted the person who was ill to be still a member of the family, an active member of the family. So the very well-meaning hospice team would go in and say, let's take the dining room table out and put the hospital bed here. And we quickly found out that some people have no desire to be
in the
on
dining
display
room. Yeah.
in the dining room, right? They want to get upstairs to their bed, even if they have to crawl up there. So yeah, these are very personal decisions about what quality of life is. And I've seen people who actually plan the what the room's going to look like, where they intend to die. So do you want light? Do you want dark? Do you want people with you? Do you want to be alone? I think I've seen so many different approaches to this. And I know myself, I probably don't want the group around the bed waiting for my last breath. Some people do. So there can be a comfort in not being alone. There can be a comfort in, I can't do it while you're staring at me.
Right. Well, and there's a lot of train of thought on that. Some people say someone will not pass
Right.
unless they're alone,
Yeah.
and then others, that isn't the case. And
Right.
we just don't know, right?
Yeah.
It's an individual thing for
Right.
sure. We
Yeah.
came in alone, we're going alone, and
Right.
that's how it works. One of the things too, though, like I thought that you were hitting on. We always imagine the person at end of life kind of at peace and calm and things, and that's not necessarily the case at all. There's a lot of times where people are very angry that these things
Yeah.
are happening to them.
Yeah.
Is there something that can be done to make it a little less, like they get agitated and things like that, that they could request that if you had written down what soothes you or calms you, like does that exist?
Sure. I mean, that's hopefully one of the things that the hospice team is trying to find out, either from the person or from their immediate caregivers. What is it that helped soothe them? What did they do? How quickly did they get sick? How quickly did things change for them, and what would they have been doing? So maybe it would have been that they loved their garden, or they loved going to the beach, or is there something we can do that still fulfills their quality of life? And if they can't do that anymore, is there some way we can simulate or give them something that does bring that peace to them? But I think there's also a point where we have to say, if a person's angry or if they're distressed when they're dying, we're not maybe going to know why. We can offer the chaplain, we can offer conversation or music or whatever it is, and if it works, great. But that's their journey. So if they need to fight their way out of this life, that's not for me to say. It's distressing to watch, and we need to support the family and the caregivers if that's what's happening.
So does hospice help? Like, I know it's very patient-oriented, but does hospice do a lot for the family caregiving? And
Yeah.
the other question, I guess, too, is, and I should know this, but I don't, so does everyone get hospice?
No.
Okay.
So many people are eligible for hospice care that either can't access it, that's a whole other story.
Right.
That's unfortunate, if they aren't offered it,
Okay.
if the doctor doesn't believe in it, or if they're not in a place where it exists where they live.
Okay.
But there is a certain point in time when someone becomes eligible medically for hospice, so then they can have it if they want it. There has been debate over the years about whether people should be offered that team and that philosophy of care, and they shouldn't have to sign on,
Right, yeah.
But that's the way it exists.
So getting back to, can you just touch a little bit about exactly what advance directives are?
So again, it's forms that typically are durable power of healthcare, durable power of attorney for healthcare that
And
gives
so-
somebody
Okay.
the right to make decisions only when someone is not unconscious or deemed incompetent. So if someone, for example, has an end-stage dementia, the doctor may be able to say this person can no longer make decisions for themselves, and then it would go to the person who has durable power of attorney or a surrogate. So if people don't have those forms in place, there's also legally a process to designate a surrogacy for healthcare person. So there's a long list of who that can be. And if none of that works, they can also have a guardian appointed. It's a court-ordered guardian to make decisions for someone.
Wow.
So yeah, that takes a little more time. So that's not your preference. That's why you want to do the forms.
Well, I was just going to say how beneficial. I mean, it just sounds so logical, but unfortunately, like it's just a really tough road.
Right.
No one wants to do that.
Right. So you brought up the DNR. DNR is if your heart stops, do you want CPR? Living will is something most people are familiar with. That's more of a list of what kinds of treatments do you want or not want. There's a tendency for people to assume if they fill out these forms that they want treatment stopped. That's not true. It's really an opportunity for you to outline what you're willing to have and not have for treatments. And really, again, I got to say the most important thing is to choose someone that you trust to make decisions for you, because all that other stuff doesn't matter because you don't know what decisions you're making.
Right, right. Also, too, I know we touched on it a little bit about where to keep it. So a lot of people call it like a life or a death file or whatever. And I like always to refer to it as a life file because I think there's a lot of information that should be put in there.
Yes.
And, you know, let's talk a little bit about the surprises. Like if you have something that you don't want someone to find out about and you think, oh, it's okay, I'm going to be dead, but like someone, you know, could find out they're adopted and they never knew they were adopted and that sort of thing. Should you sort of have someone, either in your experience, have you seen this, and do you think it's a good idea, like get rid of it prior to anything, or like what are your thoughts about that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you need to tell, you know, I think you need to come clean with some of that before you die. And we know that happens, right?
Yes.
When somebody knows they're going to die. That's one of the gifts of hospice, right? You have a little time. If you're in hospice care, you know there's an illness that's progressing. So you've got a little time to make those decisions and not have those surprises. But yeah, burn the old love letters.
Oops. Yeah, well, we're almost out of time. Any closing thoughts?
Oh, just, you know, I think everyone should think about this as a journey that is just part of our life, and to really make these decisions is a gift to the family, is a way to help people honor what you want and feel good about it after, and that's the best thing we can do.
Very, very well said. Thank you so much for taking the time to come kind of clear this up for us. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
That's all the time we have. We'll see you next time. This is Guided Crossings.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.